Welcome to a Pulp event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years, online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp event podcast, California State University Sacramento professor, Tom Krabacher, and longtime pulp collector, Walker Martin, discuss Hard-Boiled at 100, the Don Everhard stories of Gordon Young. The talk was recorded on July 29, 2017, at PulpFest 2017, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Tom begins.
Good evening, everybody. One of the nice things about at least this period, past several years and years to come, at PulpFest is that every year is a 100th anniversary of something in the pulps. And one of the things we're going to argue, and you'll see why, is that in many ways we might consider 2017 the 100th anniversary of the emergence of hard-boiled detective fiction. It's usually credited as coming in the early 20s with Black Mask, but there are some precursors to Black Mask, and probably the most important one, but maybe not widely recognized, is Gordon Young's Don Everhard, which is a serious character we're going to be talking about here. First, a little bit about Gordon Young. Gordon Young was one of the most prolific writers and one of the more popular writers in the pulp magazines during the first half of the 20th century, up to the beginning of the Second World War. He wrote for a wide range of magazines, published widely, but he's most closely associated with Adventure, where he was one of the most prolific writers to fill the pages. I did a count once and actually ranked 5th behind Hugh Pendexter, W.C. Tuttle, Bill Adams, and Talbot Mundy in terms of just the number of magazine appearances. And to sort of appreciate where he was coming from with his stories, it's probably worthwhile to get a little sense of his background. He was born in 1886 in Richmond, Missouri, which is in Ray County in central Missouri, highly rural at the time. If this photo was taken in 2009, it's highly rural still today. His family was very peripatetic. It moved around a lot in the West, which was common in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and he moved with it. In his teens, at the age of 15, he was working as a cowboy for Fred Harvey of Harvey House fame, Fred Harvey's XY Ranch in eastern Colorado. And this experience was found or influenced the shape of a lot of his stories afterwards. In 1908, he enlists in the United States Marine Corps. And after some basic training, 6 months in Washington, D.C., he's sent to the Philippines in spring of 1909. He's stationed at the naval base there in Cavite outside Olongapo, which I think is where Subic Bay eventually was established. And it was a time of the Moro Rebellion, which U.S. troops were trying to put down. It was mainly Army troops. I tried to get the Marine Corps records as to what his unit was doing, but they're in the National Archives in Washington. I've never been able to track him down, but he was likely on garrison duty. He was there for less than a year. Then he had another year and a half of shipboard duty on the USS West Virginia, which was an armored cruiser, which basically operated in the Pacific throughout this time. And this too influences stories. In 1911, he's discharged from the Marine Corps. I think because there are gaps in the biography, he gets married in August of 1911, and he starts moving southwards along the West Coast. He, later in that year, is the telegraph editor, or what we call the wire service editor today, for the Stockton Evening Standard in Stockton, California. He publishes some offbeat poetry, in the LA Times during that period. And by 1913, he's the literary editor of the Los Angeles Times. And he's basically in Los Angeles for the rest of his life. He's married, wife Regina, daughter Lena, and that's his base of operations from there on. And it's at that point he turns to writing. And we'll talk about the Don Everhard stories in a moment, but basically publishes a wide range of fiction, historical fiction, like Days of 49 about the California Gold Rush, published an adventure, had lots of footnotes with it, which was uncommon for pulp magazine stories. Testing to Authenticity, The Iron Railroad, about the building of the railroad across Kansas in the late 19th century, based on stories he heard when he was working on the ranch in eastern Colorado. But the reason I became interested in Gordon Young is, for me, because of his South Seas stories, particularly those which featured a character named Hurricane Williams. And Walker and I both found that we had really a great love for these kinds of stories. So I'll let you take over at this point, talk a bit about those.
Okay. When Tom first approached me about joining him for this discussion on Gordon Young, I was very happy to do this because in adventure, Gordon Young was one of the main writers, and he's always been a favorite with me. And for decades, I've been reading his stories. But to tell you the truth, I've always had a problem with the whole thing about Everhard being hard-boiled. I know the title of this thing is Hard-Boiled at 100, but in my opinion, Everhard was not hard-boiled. And I went over my notes. When I read a book or a pulp magazine, I make extensive notes, dates, titles, grade, my comments, and I came up with all this stuff on Gordon Young going back into the 70s, 80s, 90s. And my favorite character has always been Hurricane Williams. And as Tom said, I also like Days of 49, and I like Her Ark, the Avenger. I think it appeared in 1936 in Adventure magazine. But Everhard, my problem with Everhard is that he had a habit of like talking to the reader.
Let's wait till we get to the Everhard part, and then we can just focus on that. I want to say a few things about the Hurricane Williams stories and Her Ark, the Avenger.
Okay. Hurricane Williams if you want to talk about hard-boiled, Hurricane Williams was definitely more hard-boiled than Everhard. He would sometimes get himself into trouble from what he was saying in the magazine. Adventure always had a policy of putting dashes instead of curse words. Well, one time Hurricane Williams used the word horror in a story, and a lady wrote into Adventure saying she was a mother of teenage boys, and she was offended by the use of this word. And Hoffman, of course, wrote back saying, in the campfire section, saying that this is, how a sailor might speak, and this is what the woman was. I mean, he really liked Gordon Young a lot, and at one point he even compared Gordon Young to Joseph Conrad. And I think that's a real stretch, but certainly the Hurricane Williams stories were very interesting stories, and I liked them a lot. He also did a series starring a cowboy called Red Clark, and there was about a dozen serials, and they all appeared in Short Story magazine, which was a competitor to Adventure. But most of his best work appeared in Adventure, and I would definitely say that the Hurricane Williams character is the one to read if you want to read Gordon Young's best work.
I agree, and I think if you wanted a good example, the novel on the left, Hurricane Williams, which was its book title, but it was called The Storm Rovers it was an all-in-one issue novel of adventure in 1920, December 1920. is just a classic example of a kind of hard-boiled, what would otherwise be romantic fiction. It's about a mutiny at sea, and this isn't any kind of clickety-clackety swords clashing, Earl Flynn Douglas Fairbanks Jr. kind of mutiny. This is really brutal, this is really hard, and characters die, and sometimes horribly. And it's dramatically placed because Williams is off stage during most of the novel, and when he eventually appears after the mutiny, it's sort of electrifying in the story. But Walker brings up a point that Young was not just a prolific writer, but he was also very literate, and Hoffman, the editor of Adventure, greatly admired his work, citing the fact that he was oftentimes quoted favorably by critics, because Hoffman argued that adventure fiction doesn't just have to be cheap, disposable stuff, but it could actually be respectable literature. But this novel, Seabird of the Islands, represented a kind of breakpoint in Young's career. Young spent about 10 months working on this novel because he wanted to see it as a kind of breakthrough into mainstream literature. And if you read it, the prose is polished. It's a much more tightly structured story. But Hoffman rejected it. Other editors rejected it. He couldn't find a publisher for it in the US. Eventually it was published in Britain, and then an American publisher picked it up afterwards. But Young, in a letter to a friend, remarked that, basically it gets no better treatment in the markets than the kind of pulp fiction that he could turn out much more quickly, and essentially changed and moved into that direction to writing popular adventure fiction like Hurok the Avenger and a Western series, Red Clark. But even those, which were stories that Young tried to turn out quickly, are first rate in both literarily and as well as the stories themselves. His peak probably was in 1941 when he broke into the Saturday Evening Post with Tall in the Saddle. It was certainly his proudest accomplishment in terms of what he would tell friends, and was most popular as well in terms of sales because of the John Wayne movie that was made from it a few years later. It was one of Wayne's better westerns for RKO in the 40s, and it helped keep the book in print. And we're going to get to Everhard in just a minute now. But the thing is that Young is pretty much unknown today, except for the occasional pulp reprints like Ed Halse's reprint of Savages, or some of the things that Brian Brown does with his inexpensive BEB books. They're mostly gone. This ace double Western from 1954 is the last time any of his books saw print in America by a major publisher. In the early 60s, a couple of Red Clark books were published in translation in the Netherlands, but pretty much that's it. But what we're here to talk about eventually, I knew we'd get there, is his series character, Don Everhard. Everhard is, just to give brief background about the character, and then we can talk a bit more about the stories, a professional gambler, but he says at times he gambles on the streets as well as across the card table. He tends to be, in many ways, a cynic towards authority, towards women. He's very skeptical of women. He sees them as dangerous. And in many ways, he views himself as a dangerous individual, refers to himself as the most dangerous man in America. One point says he's killed more men than anybody in America. But at the same time, he's also a softie. Basically, when he encounters young couples who are having trouble getting together, usually because there's some bad guys putting pressure on him, then he steps in the classic romantic hearing mold. His first story was A Royal Flush of Hearts, which was Young's first published story in adventure. the start of his literary career, and it's a relatively ordinary story. Then he followed that quickly with Bluff and a Little Luck, and then Dangerous Men. He then introduces a series villain that persists for a couple of years, for 3 novels, a guy named Antoine Gaboreau. And these are appearing very quickly in Adventure. Young is cranking this stuff out like crazy. But they also are proving popular with the readers. In the July 1919 issue, as Kurt Shoemaker points out to me, readers would write in and rate their stories. In the readers' poll for one issue, Young occupied the 1st and 3rd positions. So both for Don Everhard stories. Don Everhard was a thing that Young turned back to over a course of 20 years. There are probably 30 stories published approximately, but again, very few make them in book form. The Crooked Shadows on the left is a soft cover published by Doubleday in 1924, clearly meant to be disposable reading, read and thrown away. It's very cheaply done. The Devil's Passport is, this edition is from Triangle Press, which is a subsidiary of the Sundial Press, which was a subsidiary of Doubleday. And in many ways, it was sort of the bottom feeders of popular fiction. You couldn't buy it and not have the pages turn brown almost instantly. But on the other hand, if you want to get a Gordon Young novel on eBay, there are always dozens of copies of this. And was published in Britain under a pseudonym, Paul Stewart. A couple of them were. Why Paul with 2 L's is not clear. Basically up to the end of the career, end of his career, that's what was being published. And this is where we can talk about Hard-Boiled and whether Everhard fits it. And I'll let you start with that.
Okay. I've been reading Gordon Young for 40 years, I guess, and when I think of Don Everhard, I don't think of him in terms of being a good, hard-boiled character. And I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong, and so I went back over my notes of the different stories I've read over the years, and I'd like to quote a few things, like this is from the 1970s, when I read Sorcery and Everhard, which was a 4-part serial. I read this story in the 70s, and the serial actually appeared in 1921. Yeah. This is what I had to say back then. Second Everhard story I've read, the other I never finished. Read this mainly because it came in first, ahead of many fine stories and adventure. However, I had to force myself to continue to read this. Though good in spots, it was not outstanding. It was too slow, no dialogue, nothing much happened. It was all talk and no action. Young's South Sea tales are quite good, but his detective fiction appears to be mediocre. Everhard is supposed to be a gambler, but is really a sort of goody-goody Robin Hood. One unbelievable scene is where Everhard is allowed to keep his guns while going to see the villain. Well, that would never happen in real life. You know. Though I didn't particularly enjoy this, the whole series was very popular with the readers. So that's what I felt in the 1970s. So then in the 1980s, I read the first story that Tom just mentioned, The Royal Flush of Hearts. I read it in 1986, and it's the first one appeared in February 1917. And I say in these notes, appears to be Gordon Young's first storied adventure and his first Everhard story also. In this, Everhard is a crook who mainly makes his living cheating at poker. He's a crooked gambler with a soft spot to help people out. Definitely a sort of gentleman adventurer, but not a tough private eye. Now, at the time, Ron Goulart contacted me in 1986. He was thinking of doing a book about Pulp Private Eyes, and he asked me what I thought about Everhard. And we had quite a discussion about this, and my opinion was that Everhard not be included in his book on the Pulp Private Eyes. At any rate, Goulart never did the book, so I don't know if I killed the book with that type of discussion or not, but so I would have to say my stand now is that Everhard was not that hard-boiled, and I started wondering, why did he get this reputation of being hard-boiled? Here's 100 years, we're saying Don Everhard, hard-boiled at 100. Well, if you look at Carol John Daly, you see certain similarities with Gordon Young's Everhard character. For instance, Race Williams has a habit of stopping the story dead and talking directly to the reader. And I think that Daly probably read Gordon Young's stories in the teens, and it had a big influence on Daly. That's my opinion, at least. And then, of course, now Daly has a reputation of beating Hammett to the whole subject of who wrote the first hard-boiled story. I would not say Gordon Young. I would say it's still Daly, wrote the first hard-boiled story. But of course, the big thing is that Hammett is like 10 out of 10 compared to Daly, and he's like 3 out of 10. Daly was a typical pulp hack. Some readers still like him, but Hammett is the top of the cream. He's really the best. Everhard, my opinion, he's not hard-boiled.
Now, I will offer a somewhat contrarian view. If John Woolley were here, he was going to be on this panel originally as well. He would probably argue the contrary view very dramatically, because when I passed some of the Everhard stories on to him the other year, I asked him, what do you think of these? And he came back and said, this is Carol John Daly. This is where Daly got a lot of the way to approach his type of story. It's first person. The character talks directly to the audience. Now, Hammett and other hard-boiled writers are directly to the reader. Steer away from that very quickly and don't tell the reader all about themselves and their personal values and that. But it's clear that Daly is following in that same mode. There are other things. Everhard carries twin 45s in his raincoat pockets. Race Williams carries twin 45s. There's differences, though, big differences. First of all, Gordon Young is a much more literate and sophisticated writer, whether you like the Everhard stories or not. Second is that Everhard himself is able to move in high society. As one critic, I think it was William F. Nolan wrote it, that Carol John Daly's characters tended to be more comfortable in speakeasies than society affairs, and they tended to associate illiteracy with toughness. So there are big differences. But there seems to be, I guess there's no clear evidence that Daly ever read the Gordon Young stories, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that that was the case. Robert Sampson, Bob Sampson, in one of his Yesterday's Faces books, I think it's volume 2, The Solvers, makes brief mention, maybe 4 or 5 pages, of Don Everhard as being, in many ways, the first hard-boiled writer, although the elements of what constituted sort of the hard-boiled template were just starting to take shape, and a lot of things in it, in the Everhard stories, eventually would disappear, like the braggadocio. It was replaced with more laconic style in that. But Sampson thought that you could make the case that Everhard was one of the earliest hard-boiled writers. And he does reflect a big difference in style. Prior to that time, mystery or crime fiction oftentimes was puzzle-solving ratiocination. Afterwards, it becomes more action-oriented. A lot of that is attributed to the influences of World War I. But to compare an Everhard story to one of the Jimmy Dale stories by Frank L. Packard, which I love, where in one of them, the character spends literally an entire chapter debating whether to use a gun or not when he's in a tight spot. Race Williams and Don Everhard wouldn't have thought twice, nor would the Continental Op for that matter. So I think Walker has a point that there are a lot of differences between the two, and you can make a case that maybe this isn't genuine hard-boiled, but I think the roots can be found at least lurking there, if not a direct connection of cause and effect. This is the second last slide. This is a sketch of Gordon Young. I had a hard time finding photos of him when I was doing my work, and this was a sketch that accompanied a review of one of his books in the LA Times in the 1930s. If you are interested in the Everhard stories, well, I'm sorry, that wasn't supposed to be it. The last slide, all I need is, I'm not asking for the world. There we go. If you are interested in the Everhard stories, George Vandenberg's Batter Silicon Dispatch box publishers are going to bring out the complete adventures of Don Everhard sometime, hopefully in the near future, so you can read them and decide for yourself. But of course, we know what you all really want is for the auction to get started, so shall we call it?
I just want to mention one final thing. About 30 years ago, two women approached me at my table at the PulpCon, and they introduced themselves as Gordon Young's daughter and granddaughter. And they had heard about the PulpCon being in, I don't know, where was it, Dayton?
That was when it was at the University of Dayton.
Yeah, right, at Dayton. And they wanted to know if I had any magazines with Gordon Young stories in them. And as a matter of fact, I did have several magazines there. At the time in the 80s, which I think is when these two ladies talked to me, practically nobody was collecting adventure. Everything was science fiction and hero pulps. It was really a dark period, because I was into the detective pulps, the Western pulps, the adventure pulps. I was sick and tired of the whole hero pulp scene. And these two ladies were talking about Gordon Young, and I thought that was really great, So I sold them some of my magazines that I had, and they were very happy to get them. And I thought that would be the end of it. Well, a couple months ago, I was on Cy Shanker's Pulp Flakes blog, and he was talking about Gordon Young, and I just happened to mention how 30 years ago these two ladies had approached me about Gordon Young, their daughter and a granddaughter, and by golly, they're still alive, because they must have Googled Gordon Young and came across Cy Shanker's little article on Gordon Young, and so they left a comment saying that they remembered me and that they remembered the discussion and going to PulpCon. So I just thought that's kind of cool, and it's still continuing because now they have this trunk, Gordon Young's trunk, coming up for auction, I believe tonight.
Yeah.
And Tom's very interested in this trunk since he wrote the big article on Gordon Young for Blood and Thunder magazine. So it'd be interesting to see if Tom gets this trunk. And he lives in California, so he can just pick it up.
Are you encouraging them to drive the price up? Now, just the final note, an interesting thing about the daughter and granddaughter. The daughter, I believe, has since died. She'd have been in her late 80s by now. But the two Gordon Young's grandchildren are alive, and they were the ones that approached PulpFest about the trunk. And Mike Chomka got their addresses. Now, when I was writing the article, I was hunting all over to try to find out where they are. And people would say, oh, I think they're out in California. You can find them. There's 37 million people in California. And I live in the Sacramento area, and I found out last Sunday that one of the grandchildren has been lurking in the Sacramento area all this time. So, at any rate, we're going to try and make contact and see what happens. But to the auction?
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event Podcast is copyright 2017.